argue that Luke seeks to show the encounter not as an embarrassing defeat, but rather as a victorious triumph. I also argue that the way Luke does this is by making strong allusions to Plato's Socratic apology. The great Greek philosopher Socrates lived in Athens 500 years before the narrative in Acts 17 takes place. He was commonly found teaching in the Agora, and his teachings caused an uproar in the city. Socrates was infamously brought before the court of Areopagus to face trial under accusations of corrupting the youth by introducing new divinities. And Plato details Socrates' monologic defense against these accusations in his work titled Apology. I argue that Luke, acting as Plato to Paul's Socrates, wrote his Athenian narrative in a way that strongly alludes to Plato's Apology, a very well-known work by the time of Paul's visit. Because of this, Luke's readers would develop an expectation for the narratives to have a similar outcome. For instance, at the conclusion of Plato's Apology, Socrates was condemned to death. Luke, however, subverts the reader's expectations by detailing how Paul departed from Athens not only alive, but also with a number of converts. There are a number of factors that lead me to my conclusion. In following James Westerklaw's matrix for narrative criticism, the narrative's rhetoric, setting, characterization, point of view, plot, and the readers all point to Luke's presentation of the narrative as a triumph through the usage of Platonic allusions. So the narrative begins when Paul leaves Silas and Timothy and Berea and ventures to Athens. At the time, the city of Athens held a high reputation as an intellectual center. Although the Romans of the time remained apprehensive toward philosophy, Athens acted as philosophy's representative city to the Roman Empire and did so more than adequately. The city held high prestige and symbolic value, and it was believed that all Athenians were literate, especially the Attic farmers, which was extremely rare at the time. The growth of philosophy did not replace the Greek pantheon from Athens, however, as Paul's spirit was provoked by the many idols he saw at his arrival to the city. The statue of Poseidon marked the entrance into the city. Nearby were sanctuaries for Hermes and Dionysus, both of which contained idols of Athena, Zeus, and the Muses. As Paul ventured further into Athens, he saw a shrine for Ares, a sanctuary for Aphrodite, and temples for Zeus and Apollo. Ancient writers record that the city also contained multiple altars to unknown gods. What these were they were altars that had been destroyed at one point long before, and by the time they were rebuilt, the people had forgotten who the altars were originally dedicated to. So they enshrined them as altars to unknown gods. By saying Paul's spirit was provoked, Luke was using provoke's Jewish connotations to his advantage. Provoke, or proxuno in Greek, is used in the Septuagint to describe God's anger specifically at idolatry. Luke presents Paul's provoked spirit that's caused by idolatry as the reason for the narrative's conflict, presenting Paul as an Elijah-like prophet fighting against idol worship. When Paul saw the plethora of idols present in Athens, he was not concerned with the aesthetics, but rather with the idol's impact on human lives. So he first ventured into the religious center of the Athenian Jews, and then to the commonplace of the Athenian Gentiles. It was common for the temples and common places to have public teachings, which developed a university climate in Athens. Of these, the Agora was the primary lecture hall of the first century, the Agora, or the marketplace. Xenophon records that the Agora was the favorite teaching venue of Socrates 500 years previously, so by Socratic influence, the Agora became the central location for philosophical dialogue. Luke records in verse 17 that Paul taught to the Gentiles in the famous Agora, and in this scene, Paul's preaching of Jesus seems to not have caused any issues. However, it was Paul's proclamation of the resurrection of the dead that specifically troubled the intellectual elite in the area. The problem was a result of the Greek understanding of death. The Greeks either believed the human soul decayed with the body, or that the soul would be absorbed into the cosmos. There was no room for a resurrection. Paul is not given any recorded dialogue in the scene at the Agora. Instead, Luke records only the accusations of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. Once they hear Paul's teaching on Jesus and the resurrection, they respond in verse 18 saying, quote, What does this babbler wish to say? Others said, he seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities, end quote. Greg Keener explains that babbler, or in the Greek, spermologos, is, quote, a Greek expression applied originally to birds pecking up grain, but came to apply to worthless persons, end quote. Therefore, Luke uses the babbler label to establish the hostility of the sect. On the other hand, the label preacher of foreign divinities was most likely used by Luke to remind readers of Socrates' charge of introducing new divinities centuries before. Because the Agora was a popular teaching venue for philosophy, I argue that Luke's decision to provide only the philosopher's comments is a stylistic choice used to reflect the scene's Socratic history. There appears to be a misunderstanding of Paul's teaching by the philosophers because they accuse him of preaching foreign divinities in the plural. For the polytheistic Greek audience, anastasis would have been understood as a personified deity of resurrection instead of merely the abstract term. The Athenians could have also understood Jesus as the personified power of healing. Therefore, while Paul preached Jesus and the resurrection of believers, the Athenians in the market would have misunderstood it as the preaching of new divinities of healing and restoration. And it's their misunderstanding of Paul's teaching and their accusations against him that he is a babbler and preacher of foreign divinities that furthered the plot to Areopagus. Athens could not accommodate all the prospective teachers that journeyed to it, so the city developed an accreditation process through Areopagus, a hill named for the Greek god Ares, where the city's judicial council would meet. The council was an aristocratic court instituted by Solon in the 5th century BCE and contained people of high status and wealth. The council gained such enormous influence within Athens that it began to try the city's capital cases and deliver death sentence verdicts. For example, 500 years before Acts 17 takes place, Diogenes recorded that Socrates was taken to Areopagus to face trial for, quote, introducing other new divinities, end quote, of which he was condemned to death, which by the time of Paul resulted in Areopagus having the reputation of the place Socrates was condemned to death. It is when Paul stands before Areopagus in verse 22 that Paul is finally given his first recorded dialogue in the narrative by Luke. Quote, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious, end quote. The reason for delaying Paul's recorded dialogue until now is to place primary importance on the scene at Areopagus and to draw strong allusions to Plato's Socratic apology. For instance, Luke's record of Paul's address is reminiscent of Plato's record of Socrates' introduction. Quote, in what respect you men of Athens have been affected by my accusers, I do not know, end quote. Paul then begins his apology by utilizing the idols he saw at his arrival as his prop. Quote, I found also an altar with this inscription to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you, end quote. Paul's apology centers on verses 24 and 25, wherein Paul says in a chiastic statement, quote, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by men, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything, end quote. The anaphora in the middle, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, is used specifically to highlight the transcendence of God. God does not need anything from his creation, including a dwelling place, which is the most popular human-made offerings to gods. This was very countercultural to the Athenians, whose city was littered with altars, temples, and sanctuaries dedicated to the pantheon. Although Paul presents the God he preaches as transcendent, Paul also offers God as someone readily available to humanity. Yes. Paul does this by quoting revered Greek intellectuals of the past, which establishes himself as a learned, educated man in his audience's eyes. Luke records Paul in verse 28 as saying, in him we live and move and have our being, which is a line from the philosopher-poet Epimenides' work titled Critica. Paul's next statement, for we are indeed his offspring, is a quote from the Greek didactic poet Herodotus, always we all have need of Zeus, for we are indeed his offspring. However, echoing the scene in the Agora, the problem again is not Paul's teaching of Jesus, but rather the resurrection. It is when Paul begins to preach the resurrection that he is finally interrupted, mocked, and dismissed from Areopagus. So far, the narrative has made strong allusions to Socrates and his apology recorded by Plato. Socrates was known to teach in the Agora, so it is here that Luke places Paul when he is confronted by the philosophers. Socrates was condemned specifically for introducing other new divinities, and Luke says Paul is labeled a preacher of foreign divinities. Paul begins his address to Areopagus with men of Athens, which resembles Socrates' opening in his apology, Men of Athens. And lastly, Plato wrote apology as a Socratic monologue, and Luke wrote Paul's apology as a monologue as well. And within the Pauline monologue, Paul quotes Greek intellectuals to establish himself as a Socrates-like intellectual. However, the glaring difference between the two narratives is while Socrates was unable to convince Areopagus of his innocence and was condemned to death, Paul was able to convert a number of them. As verse number 34 records, quote, "But some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius, the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them," end quote. The two names that Luke lists are significant and were purposefully given. Dionysius means one like Dionysus, the Greek god of wine. According to Dennis MacDonald and Euripides Bacchae, the god Dionysus represents the wild, irrational, miraculous, and dangerous aspects of the divine, and he is juxtaposed against Pentheus, who represents rationality. From Luke's point of view, the Greek worldview is wild and dangerous and reckless, while Paul's teachings represent order and rationality. So Luke marks the transition converts make by specifically naming Dionysius, someone that had a wild and dangerous worldview, but then made the rational decision to follow Paul's teachings. However, Luke makes sure to point out that Paul's teachings were not only effective at Areopagus. The name Damaris is most likely derived from the Greek damos, meaning wife. It is unlikely women were permitted in the Areopagus, so Damaris would not have been in attendance for Paul's apology before the council. Instead, she most likely heard Paul in the marketplace. While Luke presents Paul as a better Socrates, and the narrative's conflict takes place before the intellectual elite, Paul's teachings were not limited to philosophers. Luke shows the universality of Christianity by listing both Dionysius, an Areopagite, and Damaris, a woman who was converted through Paul's marketplace teachings. It is true that the Athenians' elitism and worldview did not allow the majority to accept Paul's teachings in the end. But while the Areopagus majority mocked Paul's teachings and were unwilling to change, a few, such as Dionysius and Damaris, are presented as dynamic characters who were moved by Paul's apology. And their change provides the purpose in Luke sharing the narrative. Although it is notable as Paul's first apology and Christianity's first defense before intellectuals, the ultimate purpose is to show not the defeat, but the triumph through the conversion of new disciples. In conclusion, Luke writes Paul's visit in Athens in a way that reflects Socrates' apology from centuries before. It was in the Agora that Socrates famously taught, and it is in the Agora Paul is confronted by Epicureans and Stoics. Both are taken to Areopagus to give their defense against the same accusation, preaching foreign divinities, and both men opened their addresses the same way, Men of Athens. However, the difference lies in the results. Socrates was killed for his teachings, unable to convince Areopagus of his innocence. Like Socrates, Paul was mocked for his teachings, not because of his preaching on Jesus, but rather his teaching on the resurrection of believers, which the Greek intellectuals were unable to reconcile with their worldview. However, unlike Socrates, Paul does not leave Areopagus a failure, because he leaves with a number of converts, such as Dionysius and Damaris, following him. Therefore, I argue Luke sets Paul as a greater Socrates. However, it is not because Paul himself is greater, but rather it is because the message Paul preaches is greater than the message of Socrates.
Yes.
The pericope is written to show that the core doctrine of Christianity, which is Jesus and the resurrection of the believers, is able to withstand the questioning of philosophy, and Luke does so through the details he presents. So three key takeaways. One, cultural relevance can be a tool to further the gospel message.
Yes.
Right.
Luke utilizes a famous work in order to prove the greaterness of Paul's message. Second is the positive framing of education. Paul is able to witness to intellectuals because he is able to speak their language.
Yeah.
Lastly, conversion stories should never be considered failures, no matter how hostile the environment may be. Thank you.
Very good.